Smoke from burning tanks rose in thick clouds, blanketing the field. Everything around was torn apart by explosions, and the air was soaked with the smell of smoke and metal. The front line was pulled as tight as a guitar string, but one small detail, seemingly bound to the fate of this battle, was about to influence who would emerge as the victor. At the moment when the soldiers froze, gazing out at the endless battlefield, Mechanic Thomas Hendricks closed his eyes and pulled something strange from his pocket. An old, rusty bolt. His hands were experienced. They seemed to know exactly what to do on their own, and this bolt was the final touch to a mechanical revolution. Plastic and metal were to be his only tools for victory. They had neither grandeur nor volume, but their role and impact on the outcome of the battle were colossal. When he inserted the bolt into the tank part, the sensation of the simple mechanical action might have seemed insignificant. But this was the beginning of the end for 50 enemy machines, the very ones that still threatened their lines. At that moment, Thomas knew, if everything went according to plan, the numbers from this day would remain in history. 50 tanks, 1 hour, without great engineers or scientists, just simple mechanics in the hands of one man. Thomas Hendricks was a simple mechanic working at a tank assembly plant. He was not an engineer, not a soldier, and certainly not a scientist. His world was full of oil, smoke, and welding seams. He couldn't and didn't want to be a hero, but circumstances led him to this moment. No one notices a mechanic on the battlefield until disaster strikes, until a tank breaks down, or until there is a catastrophic error. But Thomas always felt his work was important. And here he stood on the front lines, feeling with every new repair just how little was needed to restore hope for victory. He had long understood one thing: any system breaks if you don't intervene in time, and his task was not to follow instructions, but to turn a mechanical failure into a chance for victory. This was his unique talent. He wasn't interested in just fixing breakdowns. He looked for ways to remodel parts, to improve them so they didn't just do their job, but turned into weapons. That day, everything changed. He saw a tank that was just an empty shell awaiting its death, and decided he could make it better despite all the threats. The mechanism was worn out. The firing tanks on the battlefield were beyond ordinary repair. He knew that any mistake, any oversight, could cost his soldiers their lives. However, just when the situation was most critical, Hendricks discovered he didn't have the necessary parts to modify the tank. The ordinary tools he had could not be used for such a complex task. But at some moment his gaze fell upon a bolt, a simple part that was to become the solution to all problems. With this bolt, he had to restore the tank's combat capability, though he knew it was not an easy path. Nevertheless, Thomas understood that for victory, he needed to do more than just complete a standard repair. He had to add something of his own, something unexpected. This was his chance to turn the tide of battle. Thomas discovered that the ordinary bolt he had just used for a minor modification held all the power necessary to overcome the crisis. He decided to conduct an experiment. This simple part could be used to reinforce one of the key parts of the tank's mechanism, turning it into a machine capable of fighting the enemy much more effectively. The moment of truth came when he installed the bolt in the right place, in the cooling system. He simply used it to change the angle of air intake into the engine. This gave the tank an additional 30% power, which meant the machine could now move faster and destroy more enemies. It was a moment when mechanics itself predicted his success. When the tank first moved into battle after the modification, there were no bright fireworks or spectacular effects. It was just a series of small changes that proved so powerful they allowed the machine to destroy several enemy tanks in just a few minutes. Thomas and his team stood by the combat tanks, watching as they crushed the enemy one by one. They couldn't believe that a single bolt could be such a solution. Cliffhanger. But, as often happens in war, when one door opens, another closes. Soon after the first success, the situation on the battlefield became much more dangerous. The tank faced a new challenge. As always, mechanics required constant adjustments. Thomas Hendricks stood on the battlefield, buffeted by the cold wind, feeling the ground tremble beneath his feet from the sounds of explosions and gunfire. Everything around him was in chaos: smoke, fire, scattered figures of soldiers. But amidst all this, he felt only one thing: the need to act again before the enemy could adapt. His tank was once again at the center of the offensive, and despite the successful start, it now faced a far more serious danger. He looked into the engine compartment again, where the rusty bolt that had ensured the first success now seemed insufficient for the next stage. Hendricks saw the tank track slipping in the loose soil and the engine burying itself in the sand. He knew another struggle with limited capabilities lay ahead, and again, on the verge of despair, he began to look for a solution among what was at hand. With each day, the stakes rose. The enemy tanks, pushing deeper, were becoming increasingly serious opponents. But on such fronts, a simple engineering solution often helped more than the most complex plans. This time, Thomas decided not to rely on the bolt alone. He asked himself, if his old bolt could increase speed, what if he used it as a basis to increase the tank's maneuverability and stability? Not just adaptation, but something more. He followed his intuitive path again and began looking for a second key part capable of strengthening the existing system. And so, when he inserted another object into the already modified part of the tank, an old pipe found in the rubble, the action worked again. Mechanics, which once seemed incredibly simple, now made the tank contain deadly power. With the help of pipes and bolts, Thomas created a system that enhanced heat radiation in the engine, which in turn allowed the tank to operate at maximum power without overheating. The enemy didn't know what they were facing. An hour later, the tank was already in battle, its speed increased by 40%. A detachment of enemy tanks trying to retake the position found themselves in a trap. With every movement, Hendricks felt more confident. The modification he made proved its effectiveness. But victory was far off. Everything depended on whether they could withstand the encounter with heavier enemy tanks that were pushing forward with equal determination. New obstacles constantly arose on the battlefields. Every turn in the fight brought them closer to the next test. War wasn't won by this simple engineering solution alone, but Thomas knew their chance lay in precisely such solutions. The detachment of German tanks that encountered these improved masterpieces of engineering thought did not remain on the sidelines. Enemy crews began to use their own developments and adapt their equipment to the new conditions. However, the result was stunning. The encounter with this improved tank turned out to be a real surprise for the enemy. It seemed that the technological solutions Hendricks used began to take an unexpected turn. German engineers took a closer look and started working on their own modifications. But they weren't ready for what Thomas had created. Tanks equipped with his improvements demonstrated unprecedented speed and maneuverability, something the enemy couldn't achieve with their standard tanks. German tanks faced an unpredictable and fast machine that changed their usual tactics. Every hit was now less of a guarantee and more of a risky step for those trying to attack. Everyone on the battlefield began to realize that the actions of this simple mechanic had become an important link in the chain of victories. Over time, thanks to his efforts, the tanks began to bring military successes. As his modifications became more known among the Allied forces, Thomas Hendricks acquired a status he never expected. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a hero in the usual sense. But his engineering solution ensured the salvation of many lives and became the key to Allied success on one of the war's most dangerous fronts. After the battle, it was determined that thanks to his mechanics, more than 50 enemy machines were destroyed in 1 hour. With every new tank equipped with his solutions, the chances of victory increased. By the end of the operation, intelligence data showed that tanks equipped with Hendricks's improvements had become the main force on the battlefield. 50 enemy machines were destroyed in just 1 hour, and Allied losses decreased by 25%. After the war, Thomas returned home as an ordinary man. He remained a mechanic, receiving no official awards. But the story of his feat passed along the entire front and was told at military conferences. It was precisely such simple solutions, such seemingly insignificant changes like a bolt or a pipe, that made him a hero to many. But for him, the most valuable thing remained that he was able to change the outcome of the war without being a scientist or a soldier. On the front, there was silence again, the kind that always precedes a storm. Thomas Hendricks stood in the trenches, feeling the cold wind pierce his uniform. Far ahead, enemy tanks began to line up again, their metal hulls reflecting the dim light of the dying day. This was their second clash in the last 72 hours, and Thomas knew their victory was only partially secured. The action of the bolt, pipes, and other modifications allowed them to survive, but the enemy was not sitting idle. His tank, equipped with new improvements, was on the verge of becoming the main weapon on the battlefield once more. But the new enemy was becoming deadlier by the hour, and Thomas felt his achievements could become useless at any moment. When he looked into the engine again, he realized he needed to go further. His mechanics had to be even more complex, even more precise. Time was running out. The final battles were raging on the field, and mechanics were once again on the front line. As enemy tanks began to advance toward them, Hendricks opened the engine cover one more time. He knew that the bolt alone could no longer give the result he wanted. But what if he added one more detail? That is exactly what he began to do. New mechanisms joined his rework, becoming more than just a repair with every step. He decided to install an additional pin that could further speed up the engine cooling system while simultaneously increasing its resistance to damage. It was simple mechanics, but with a huge effect. When the tank went into battle again, the engines not only worked at full power, but demonstrated such efficiency that the enemy couldn't even get close to their defense line. The tank tore across the battlefield, flying like a cruise missile. The entire army was shocked to see how this single improved tank could destroy several enemy machines alone. But Thomas knew that victory was only temporary. If they wanted to survive, they would need to find new ways to maintain this success. At this time, German tankers watching the events began to adjust their actions. On the battlefield, enemy machines were already applying new tactics. They started working in groups, trying to pressure one of the Allies' weak points. Hendricks could only watch as one of his machines was surrounded by enemy tanks. He understood that their task now was not just to hold the position, but to create a tactic that would allow them to avoid this encirclement in the future. At that moment, he had to use his resourcefulness and, despite the severity of the situation, come up with yet another engineering modification. Thomas barely maneuvered the tank out of the encirclement using the old familiar pipe, which he installed as an element for high-speed turning. This helped him maneuver and break out of the encirclement, leaving the enemy confused. With every hour, the situation became more tense, but this very moment cemented Hendrix's status as the chief mechanic on the front. Rumors appeared about how his inventions helped the Allies win the battle. Despite not receiving military awards, his name became known on all fronts, and his works began to be used by other soldiers and mechanics. Hendrix did not aim to become a war legend, but his engineering solutions became an important element in the strategic victory of the Allies. Every modification of his was like a small victory, not only for him, but for his comrades who were able to survive thanks to his innovations. Over the next few months, thanks to his efforts, the number of destroyed enemy tanks continued to grow. Each new modification brought its share of victories. In 1 week alone, 10 tanks equipped with his systems destroyed more than 100 enemy machines. In just a month, they managed to change the course of the battle, destroying 500 enemies. After the end of the war, Thomas returned home. He was no longer just a factory mechanic. His name had become a legend among those who knew that a simple engineer could change the course of war without possessing great knowledge or access to secret technologies. Subsequently, his inventions became the basis for many new engineering solutions that improved combat vehicles on the battlefield. But for Thomas, as for many, this story was just a small moment amidst a great war. The war ended, but his ideas and engineering finds continued to live. Thomas Hendrix sat in the dim corner of his workspace, barely distinguishing the outlines of the tools that had long been his only companions. The war was long over, but its traces remained in his hands, in his decisions, and in his thoughts. He replayed the last events in his head over and over, not believing what he had managed to achieve. But the life of a mechanic did not stop. New challenges arose on the horizon, and Thomas knew that despite the peacetime, his engineering talent could still be useful. He returned to the factory where he once worked, but now his approach was different. The simple mechanic who became a hero thanks to his engineering genius was once again among those creating machines. However, after the war, in peacetime conditions, there was no place for miracles. Mechanics was increasingly pushed aside, giving way to new technologies. But for Thomas, one thing was important. He continued to look for solutions just as before, and one of them could become his last great project. Thomas knew it was necessary to continue using his developments. He began working on modifications that could improve not only tanks, but other types of machinery, applying them to new, peaceful conditions. However, he still couldn't forget those days when his work saved lives. One day, standing again before a part of an old tank they used for testing, Hendrix noticed details that hadn't seemed important to him before. This moment became decisive for him. He realized his engineering resourcefulness could be useful not only on the battlefield, but also in civilian life. Using his knowledge of mechanics, Thomas began developing a modification for new civilian transport. He applied the same principles of cooling and stability he used in military tanks to create more stable and efficient systems for motor transport. Work proceeded slowly, but despite everything, he kept working. This project seemed far from war, but its essence remained the same: to find a solution that could change the situation in his favor. At every stage, starting from the first sketches, Thomas faced difficulties, but each of them only hardened him. The engineering intuition that once saved lives on the battlefield was now directed at creating a new solution for peaceful life. And again, this world was full of the same mechanical problems he solved during the war years. Thomas always knew that every good idea would be met with resistance. It was the same now. Even in peacetime, his approaches were not understood or accepted by everyone. Colleagues laughed when he presented his new developments. After all, they were too old-fashioned, too simple. However, for Hendricks, it was important not to prove he was right, but to find a solution that would bring success. Many considered his approach too mechanical, limited to simple solutions. But just like on the battlefield, it was these simple ideas that became the very things that changed the situation. And again, Hendricks found himself in the center of a dispute, but now his enemy was not enemy troops, but corporate bureaucracy. He felt how slowly but surely his ideas were finding a response in some colleagues who began to understand that there was something more in his approaches. They weren't fast, they weren't flashy, but every step was precise, like a rifle shot at 1,000 meters. No matter how some of his colleagues resisted, his developments began to influence the enterprise's success. Over time, Thomas became known in his field not as a war winner, but as a mechanic who turned a simple understanding of technology into a new reality. He didn't seek recognition, but his works became the basis for many new machines. When the first modifications were introduced into mass production, the success was obvious. New machines created based on his engineering solutions showed an efficiency increase of 25%. His name began to be mentioned among the largest developers, and even those who were skeptical of his ideas admitted their contribution to success. However, for Hendricks himself, everything was simpler. He was not a war hero, but simply a man who knew how to use his head and hands to change the world around him. His works weren't as spectacular as many feared. He was an ordinary mechanic, but his ideas changed not only tanks, but the future. Ultimately, thanks to his inventions, industries using his technologies were able to significantly improve their productivity. Hendricks's engineering solutions became standards for many types of equipment. In particular, machines equipped with his modifications became 1.5 times more efficient, which allowed for reduced operating costs and increased reliability. After the end of the war and the return to peaceful life, Thomas Hendricks continued his work in peaceful production. He was just an old mechanic to many, but for those who saw his work, he was a man who, without pathos or unnecessary words, changed the face of the industry. His ideas became the basis for a whole wave of innovations that influenced the development of transport and civil machinery. What started as a minor modification of military equipment had now become a global basis for future inventions. This was Hendricks's strength, in his ability to see opportunity where others saw a problem. Night fell again on Hendricks's small workshop. Walks around the factory and continuous work with new technologies became his daily reality. It was a time of calm, but tension still hung in the air. Even if the war ended, for people like Thomas, it never ends. His hands continued to work with the same tools, but there was more confidence in them. Mechanics, which once saved lives on the battlefield, now found application in civilian life. Soon a new challenge arose on the horizon. Thomas realized his work would not be limited to perfecting combat vehicles. He began to notice a key problem that worried him: the reliability of old systems under harsh operating conditions. And although the project to create new vehicles was important, he increasingly thought about how existing solutions could be improved. With every month, with every day, he felt more and more how his past successes began to turn into something greater. And now he needed to find a solution for a new task: how to adapt old machines used on the battlefield to the new conditions of peacetime without losing their efficiency. Thomas decided to test his idea on an old army truck that was in the warehouse. He knew it wouldn't be easy. To change the truck, one had to not only consider mechanical characteristics, but also solve a whole range of technical tasks related to long-term operation. The first tests with his modifications showed amazing results. The truck, once used only for military needs, now became a highly efficient means of transport for civilian purposes. He equipped it with reinforced suspension, an improved cooling system, and a unique mass distribution method that allowed it to not only work at higher loads, but also over greater distances. The task was to take one old vehicle and turn it into something completely new, adapted to modern requirements. It wasn't just an improvement, it was a real engineering breakthrough. Thomas perfected the transmission and suspension system, making the truck more maneuverable and stable. However, not everyone accepted these changes immediately. At the factory, many looked at him with doubt, as such modifications were too complex for mass production. Nevertheless, the result was not long in coming. Tests showed that the truck became 20% more efficient in load capacity and consumed 15% less fuel. The task Thomas was solving was not related to an enemy, but his efforts still met resistance. Critical remarks began to appear at the factory regarding the deadlines for implementing new modifications. Mechanics from other departments increasingly began to state that Hendrix's improvements were too costly and complex. But for Thomas, what mattered was not what his colleagues said, but what happened to his machines after the rework. He saw them becoming significantly more efficient and knew this work was worth it. His method was, in essence, a fight against a system that had long stagnated. He knew that the faster his solutions were implemented, the faster they could be used in civilian life, not just on the battlefield. When his modifications were ready for production and the first tests showed impressive results, everything changed. Colleagues began to notice how his machines became not just practical, but superior in efficiency to everything available at that moment. Interest in his work grew, and then, one day, when the results of his work were presented to top management, Thomas Hendrix finally heard words of recognition. He didn't wait for it, but it was necessary for his work. His innovations now served not only in military, but also in peaceful life. When the first machines improved by his methods began to enter service, they showed that their efficiency was 30% higher than old models. This allowed for saving huge resources on fuel and maintenance, as well as improving production indicators by 25%. The project, which was once just a set of tools and ideas, had now become the basis for new standards in mechanics. The influence of his work on the industry became so significant that many of his colleagues recognized his merits. After completing work on civilian vehicles, Thomas continued to work in his workshop. His life as a mechanic who once saved troops on the battlefield now continued among peaceful people, but with the same enthusiasm and determination. He remained a man who knew how to use his head and hands to make the impossible possible. His innovations continued to live in new machines and mechanisms that were becoming an integral part of the future. Thomas Hendrix, now a senior engineer, sat in his office, surrounded by blueprints and projects. Every part on the table was familiar, but this time it had a different meaning. He wasn't that young mechanic who once repaired tanks and created miracles on the battlefield with an old bolt. But the same ideas still swirled in his head as during the war years, when his every step was dictated by the need to survive and win. Now a different task stood before him, to work on improving civilian equipment, which was to become part of post-war industrialization. However, old habits don't disappear so quickly. Hendricks was sure that the key to success lay in simple solutions capable of radically changing efficiency. And although the world around him was changing, he remained true to his philosophy. The simpler and more accessible the solution, the more powerful it is. He sharpened his gaze again on several old mechanisms that demanded attention once more. The process wasn't as urgent as before, but he knew, if he didn't start acting now, his works could fade into oblivion. This time, he needed to adapt the cooling system for a new truck, a system that had to work efficiently even in the most extreme operating conditions. He used principles that once saved him in war conditions, but now they became part of civilian work. However, facing this task, he felt old demons returning, the very technical problems that once threatened his previous projects. Thomas quickly found a solution, an improved pipe system that would allow fluids to circulate at the right points. But now it was important not only to make the system efficient, but also to minimize its weight, as every extra gram could affect the car's efficiency. A simple mechanism with pipes and bolts once again became the key to success. He was able to create a system that not only increased cooling efficiency, but also cheapened production. But despite this, Hendricks felt his work was not yet complete. Meanwhile, at the factory where he worked, new questions began to arise. Someone began to wonder if it was worth implementing such innovations that were so non-standard and untested in the broad market. Hendricks knew this wasn't for nothing. His solutions often went against existing standards. Once again, his work was questioned. But for Hendricks, this was only confirmation that his ideas were correct. A simple and accessible approach to technology could not help but affect those used to working by templates. At that moment, his efforts were once again perceived as radical, as ones that could lead to a big leap in the development of the entire industry. Hendricks didn't give up. He knew that one small detail, the very one that might seem insignificant to others, could be the solution that would make his projects not just successful, but change the future. When his project was presented to a wide audience, his ideas finally began to acquire serious value. Every improvement, be it a cooling system or reinforced suspension, became increasingly in demand. He became not just a mechanic again, but a person who could overcome technical obstacles, making technology accessible and understandable. However, his name was still not as famous as that of major engineers or designers. But for Thomas, this wasn't important. He continued to work and apply his knowledge to improve the world around him. When the changes he implemented began to show real results, their scale became obvious. Using his developments, cars and machines became 30% more efficient in fuel consumption and 20% faster in operation. But for Hendricks, the important thing wasn't how much they saved, but that his engineering solutions became the basis for a new wave of changes in the industry. His achievements began to be perceived not as a temporary improvement, but as an integral part of long-term progress. When a car created with his technologies drove more than 5,000 kilometers without breakdowns, everyone understood that his ideas were exactly what was needed for the post-war world. Hendricks continued to work, gradually changing approaches in various industries. However, despite recognition in the industry, he still remained that same humble engineer who saw his work as a means of achieving utility, not fame. His methods continued to influence the development of the automotive industry and later other spheres. He didn't become famous outside his work, but for those who knew him and his methods, Hendricks was a real hero. Several years passed, and Thomas Hendricks found himself in a completely new reality. Every year his achievements became more recognizable, but now, in the post-war years, he wanted more. He began working in a completely different direction, which no longer concerned war, but remained no less significant for changing the future. Mechanics and engineering continued to be his passion, and he was sure his ideas could create a new era for the entire industry. But even in peacetime, challenges still remained. His ideas about the importance of simple solutions and mechanical structures began to sound increasingly relevant, as if old ideas were returning to the forefront. A new problem, how to avoid overload and waste of resources in conditions of peaceful industry, was becoming more acute. Thomas looked again at an old part, the engine of an old Soviet truck that ended up in their laboratory. He remembered how many years ago he used simple mechanisms to save lives on the battlefield. But now he had a chance to do something more significant. This was the moment when all of Hendricks's past achievements could lead to a new breakthrough. When Thomas began working with the engine, he immediately noticed weak points in the design. Many of them were obvious, but no one had tried to solve them from the standpoint of simplicity before. He began planning how to change the fuel supply system to improve its efficiency, and how to improve the transmission design to reduce the load on the engine. During the work, he used old, proven mechanisms, adding new solutions to increase operational stability. He implemented a system that allowed for more efficient use of heat from the engine, reducing its excessive load. A simple element he added turned out to be the key to the solution: improved airflow circulation in the cooling system, which reduced heating and extended service life. Every day, Hendricks watched the results of his work with growing satisfaction. His solutions weren't loud and new, but they proved incredibly effective in the long run. This earned him respect among his colleagues, despite the modesty of his methods. Not everyone was ready to admit the changes Hendricks proposed. Many believed his methods still remained too primitive for new technologies. However, in practice, as his reworkings were introduced into real production, it became obvious. The simplicity of the solution significantly increased reliability and efficiency. Colleagues from different departments began to reconsider their point of view. Abandoning complex and expensive technologies in favor of cheaper and more reliable solutions became the main criterion for success in new developments. However, the opposition between the old school and new solutions continued to exist. Some still argued that such simple methods couldn't be so effective in the future. But for Hendricks, it was important not only to have his ideas recognized, but also the practical application of the results. He continued to work at his own rhythm, paying no attention to resistance. As soon as the results of his work were presented at the highest levels, his efforts finally received recognition. Implementing his solutions into mass production gave impressive results. Machines with his improvements showed 25% greater efficiency than previous models. But for Hendricks, this wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that his methods and approaches began to be actively used worldwide. Now his developments became standards in some industries, and Hendricks's name became synonymous with reliability and simplicity. He didn't seek fame, but still became an example for many engineers. His approach turned out to be exactly what the world needed: rational, simple, and effective. When new machines equipped with Hendrix's improvements began to enter service, the results spoke for themselves. Work machines became more durable, with lower maintenance costs and much greater productivity. Fuel savings, increased operating speed, reduced frequency of breakdowns. All this led to a significant reduction in operating costs. Ultimately, statistics showed, based on his innovations, more than 5,000 new machines were created, which were used in various industries, from construction to agriculture, and all of them showed stable productivity growth of 15 to 25%. When Hendrix ended his career, he left behind a mark that continued to live in his works. Even if his name wasn't loud and widely known, his ideas and methods were implemented into a multitude of projects around the world. He became an example for future generations of engineers who realized that simplicity and reliability are not just a philosophy, but a necessity for real progress. After completing his work, Thomas Hendrix became the embodiment of a quiet genius who changed the future without unnecessary words and noise. A multitude of new machines that used his improvements became an important stage in the evolution of technology. The technologies created by him continued to live and develop, and his simple engineering solutions became the foundation for new inventions in the field of transport. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. We release new clips every day, and even more exciting and shocking military stories await you ahead.